Today, we're going to dive into a really provocative essay by an author named Lakeman. It tries to connect two enormous concepts, globalism and human evolution. And it asks a pretty shocking question. Is our super interconnected world actually pushing humanity down a biological path toward extinction? And wow, the essay does not waste any time getting to the point. This quote right here is the core thesis. The argument isn't just that globalism is about trade or politics. No, it's framed as this massive, existential threat that is literally starving evolution of its most vital resource, diversity. So to really unpack this pretty radical claim, we first have to get our heads around the author's view of evolution. It all, and I mean all, hinges on this one idea that diversity is the essential fuel for life itself. So what do they mean by fuel? Well, in this essay, fuel is the raw material that evolution has to work with, all that variation. We're talking variety in our genes, in our cultures, in our ideas. The author's point is that without this constant variety, a species just can't adapt to new challenges. It gets stuck, it becomes vulnerable, and ultimately, it risks going extinct. To back this up, the source points to a pretty wild example, the history of insects. I mean, look at this timeline. Insects showed up hundreds of millions of years before mammals did, and they just exploded into countless different forms. The author argues that this incredible diversification is exactly what made them so resilient, what allowed them to be the first to fly and to take over nearly every ecosystem on the planet. So, how exactly does this engine of evolution work, according to the text? Well, it's laid out as a multi-step process. First, you've got genetic variation, which creates this big pool of different traits. Then, natural selection comes in and picks the traits that are best suited for the environment. This is what builds resilience, right? It makes sure that when a disaster, like a new disease, comes along, some individuals are probably going to survive. And finally, you have migration, which lets groups move apart and form new, distinct communities that just add more fuel to this whole cycle. Okay, so now that we have that biological foundation down, the author introduces the villain of the story, what they call the globalist empire. And this is the force they believe is actively trying to shut down this whole natural process of diversification. Now, the author wants to make one thing really clear. On the surface, globalism looks decentralized, right? Like a network of equals. An empire, on the other hand, is a very obvious top-down system of control. But, and this is a big but, the essay argues that this distinction is just a clever trick. And this is where things get really intense. The author claims that modern globalism is really just an empire wearing a mask. The essay alleges that the leaders you see at global summits are actually operating under a system of, and I'm quoting directly here, master-slave oppression. It's a very direct and, frankly, very critical shot at institutions like the World Economic Forum. So what's the end goal of this so-called empire? Well, according to this essay, it's to force a single, unified model on the entire world. And if you're going to do that, you inherently have to get rid of the very diversity that the author sees as essential for survival. The source gives a few key examples of how this is supposedly happening right now. It talks about a matrix-like global consumer culture that just flattens out unique traditions. It points to economic imperialism, where these giant corporations just steamroll local businesses. The author also argues that certain kinds of mass immigration can wear away at a country's native culture, and that our cities are all starting to look the same, losing their unique architectural character. Now, what's really interesting is how the source deals with any counter-arguments. It kind of sets them up, these alternative perspectives, and then boom, it knocks them right down to reinforce its own point. Okay, so for instance, here's a pretty common argument you hear in favor of globalization, that it can bring people together, create these vibrant, multicultural societies where everyone benefits. Sounds good, right? Well, the author's response, it's a hard no. The text flat out claims that true cultural integration is impossible. And the reason? What it calls unhinged belief conflicts, both between different cultures and even inside of them. All right, here's another alternative view the essay brings up. The idea that for globalization to actually work, you need strong, distinct national identities to contribute to the whole thing. And here, the author kind of agrees, but then adds this really crucial twist. They say, sure, national identities are key, but the real evolutionary point of migration isn't to create one big melting pot. No, it's to allow for the separation of groups so they can form new and completely distinct fusion communities. And this is where the cultural argument gets tied directly back to biology in a,
well, in a very inflammatory way. The essay claims that pushing for a unified mindset leads to a cloudy genetic pool. It then tries to link specific physical traits to negative behaviors. Now, it is absolutely crucial to state that this is a direct quote from the source, and it's presenting a pseudoscientific attempt to connect social policy directly to genetic outcomes.
So, where does all of this lead? Well, this is where the author pulls all these different threads together: the evolution stuff, the anti-globalist criticism, the controversial claims about genetics, and paints a very, very bleak picture of our future. And one of the big pressure points in this whole equation, according to the text, is population. Think about it. Our population has exploded to over 8 billion people in less than 200 years. The author argues this puts this incredible strain on our resources and just speeds up what they see as the destructive nature of the whole globalist system.
The text then makes this very specific and pretty unusual geopolitical prediction, which, by the way, is written in all capital letters in the original essay. It claims that by 2026, the world will be split in two. You'll have a peaceful partnership of BRICS nations focused on food versus what it calls an aggressive alliance of the USA, Europe, and parts of the Middle East who are accused of making weapons of death for money.
So after all that, what's the proposed solution to this impending doom? The author's final message is a complete retreat from the global stage. They argue that the only way to survive is through radical localism, building these small, peaceful, self-sufficient community village neighborhoods, and totally rejecting what they call the insanity of greed that's driving world leaders. So in the end, this essay really frames our entire future as a huge battle between two opposing forces. On one side, you've got this global push towards making everything and everyone the same. And on the other, you have what the author says is an evolutionary demand for local diversity. So the question it leaves you with is, which one of those forces is ultimately going to shape the future of our species?